Okay, hello. Sorry, we had a few technical issues there. Well, thank you for joining me. My name's Ian Rogers. I'm the founder and chief exec of a company called Procync Limited, which we'll find a little bit out about later on. I'll just wait for a little bit for some other people to join. We've got nearly 20 people here, which is great. Hi, Ralph. See you all here as well, which is great.
Hi, Ian. Nice to be here.
For an interesting discussion on where we think the industry is at the moment.
It's always exciting to talk about our industry.
Yeah, absolutely.
So what do you have in store for us today?
Well, today, I'm trying not to be too negative, but I'm putting out a lot of facts and figures in terms of where I see the industry at the moment and where the issues are, and then a little bit of information on where I think we can go. And
an honest evaluation.
Absolutely. From my perspective, and I'm sure you may have some other perspectives as well. Try and get a little bit of chat going in the chat box. I've got a questionnaire later on. So just an interesting ride to open up people's eyes as to where the industry is at this moment in time, hopefully where we can start to improve it.
Good.
So we seem to stabilize around the 20 mark, so I'll get going. I presume everybody can see my slide. So I'll start the ball rolling. So as we've just discussed, today is really about an introduction into the challenges the industry faces and a snippet of information on what I think some of the solutions that can be applied to help the industry move forward from where we are at the moment. So today I'm going to be discussing with Ralph as we go along, but throwing a lot of facts and figures out just to try and get an overall perception as to where we are at this moment in time. So why this topic matters? Construction industry is about 13% of global GDP. So construction is an incredibly important aspect of most economies in the world, even in small countries, because without construction and the built environment, we wouldn't be able to live, work, play, or what have you. It affects every aspect of human life these days. So it is a very important and major aspect of all economies, whether those economies are rich or poor. However, in my opinion, 98% of projects fail. I know that's a provocative statement, and I've got that backed up by reports, and I'll go into this as to why I believe 98% of projects fail. I'm sure we've got our own interpretation of this and our own views. Productivity is not increasing, even though we're bringing more and more new technology, new IT systems and what have you to the industry. Productivity is not increasing at all, or hardly at all, compared to a lot of other industries, and we'll explore that a little bit. We cannot afford for this inefficiency to carry on any longer, because in my opinion, if we don't, the industry could potentially die or not be as effective as it ought to be. I don't know whether you've got any thoughts on that introduction perspective, Ralph.
Well, I think we should probably define fail, because I mean, most people would say for thousands of years we've been building buildings and we continue to build buildings. So we do deliver buildings and infrastructure. So but you know, like if you were being skeptical, you might say, well, it hasn't failed. I mean, it does deliver, but maybe fail is it delivers poorly. So it's not sustainable. Like we're using too much resource, we're producing too much CO2, we killing too many people through safety concerns, etc. So I think you just got to be clear about the word fail.
Yeah. Agree, and I'll hopefully define that shortly. So in my opinion, the industry is broken at the moment. Again, another provocative clickbait statement, I know, but when you go through some of these statistics, you'll understand why I'm saying some of these things. So global productivity has grown in most sectors, But in the construction industry, it has pretty well stagnated over the last 25, 30 years or so. Therefore, it's time for a new approach. So when you look at this graph, that sort of starts to highlight where construction has stagnated. I mean, even agriculture is improving their productivity and is now regarded to be more productive than the construction industry, which is, I think, quite an indictment on the industry. Manufacturing is always improving because they have to stay competitive. But for some reason, construction has not increased its productivity hardly at all. It's just pretty well flatlining. So that is a major issue, in my opinion. Without that, we're just going to become more and more costly, and therefore potentially less and less buildings will be built against what could be done to improve the economy overall. Because don't forget, without those buildings, the economy of countries doesn't perform very well. And you know, without offices, factories, homes, all of that sort of thing, that impacts the wider economy. So some of the definitions I'm going to go into, picking up on Ralph's point, what is failure? So we're used to chronic cost overruns and delays. As I said, low productivity, but also high wastage. There are some sites I know and some organisations like Skanska that really put waste on a high pedestal and drive out waste completely, more or less. But there is a heck of a lot of the industry that just doesn't do that. We've also got a very adversarial culture with legal disputes, which cost further money and disrupt the whole process. So these are starting to get into some of the things that I think evolve what I would define as failure. So when you look at some of the statistics, 47.9% of projects come in on budget, just by taking that dynamic in its own right. But if you add time to that, only 8.5% of projects come in on time and to budget. Then if you look at all the normal measures of on time, to budget, meeting the specifications and all those sorts of criteria, only 0.5% of the projects meet all of those requirements at the end of the project period, without issues like delays, cost overruns, rework, quality issues, and all of those sorts of things. So that's why I'm saying overall 98% of projects fail. And that has come from a number of reports, primarily from McKinsey & Partners, who are one of the big management consultancies, and other people like Bent Fliedberg, who have analysed the industry and come up with these sorts of statistics. So I'm measuring it from that point of view. I mean, have you got a different view, Ralph, in terms of success or failure of projects?
Just to sort of help the debate, I suppose, you could say everybody involved in all of these projects has made a successful career out of delivering these projects, and all the lawyers are making lots of money. Yeah. So, yeah, I think maybe it's a little bit cynical, but we're not delivering, like, it's absolutely true, we're not delivering enough infrastructure for the world. But the AEC sector is supporting, as you said, almost 15% of global GDP. So there is an economy, but it's a misaligned economy, maybe. It's a better way of thinking about it.
Yeah.
So, like, 100% of projects have made a career and have made money for somebody. Maybe not the right people, but I mean, we're experiencing it in Ireland. In Ireland, we would call ourselves a first world country, but we don't have enough housing, we don't have enough education facilities, we don't have enough hospital facilities, we don't have enough infrastructure to meet the needs of our citizens. So even though we have a competent industry, and going back to you, like, we're just not delivering enough. But still, people involved in the industry are making a living, let's say.
Yeah. I mean, from those perspectives, you could say that that is a success. Yes, we have buildings, and some of them very striking, efficient, and well thought out buildings. But at what other cost? Could we have had two of those buildings for the same cost if the industry had been more efficient? Therefore, that would have driven the economy even further. Could we have had
and that's exactly what manufacturing is doing. Like manufacturing is getting cheaper all the time because they're making twice as many cars as they did 40 years ago. They're making twice as many gadgets or whatever. So the efficiency, productivity is allowing manufacturing not only to meet the need, but to meet the need with lower cost. And so that's the definition of a productivity increase. But when you look at infrastructure, 40 years ago, many people could afford a house. Now people can't. It's just that's the outcome of low productivity.
I mean, there's other economics around the affordability of housing, but I mean, earlier this morning I was having a discussion in the area I come from in the Caribbean, where we're looking at low-cost housing to make it affordable for local young people to have a place to live. And it is a real challenge because the housing associations are setting thresholds which are not achievable. But on the other hand, if you don't achieve those thresholds, then certain demographic of society cannot afford to buy or rent a house. And therefore, where do they go? So there's some key dynamics here through efficiency. And what I'm trying to do through this initial webinar is set the scene as to where I think a number of the inefficiencies are, and then start to look at how we could potentially change the industry. And that, at the end of the day, is what BIM Heroes is about, is improving the industry at large for the betterment of society. I know that's Ralph's passion as to what BIM Heroes is about. Okay, so
we're going to make it better.
Yeah, absolutely. Sorry, just coming back up here. So you look at some of the statistics to underline some of these messages as well. 80% of project costs are time related. Like, for instance, your good old preliminaries, that's all time related in terms of hiring of the huts, hiring of excavators or what have you. That's all time related. So are we looking at that in terms of how efficient we are in terms of the time to deliver a project? And I'm looking at systems that could speed up the whole construction process, particularly again here in the Caribbean. I mean, I'm working on a project at the moment where their traditional way of building through steel frame encased in concrete with concrete block work to put a 7-story office building up, traditionally that way here, currently takes up to 18 months. Whereas we're looking at a system that could potentially put that up in 14 weeks. Yes, the system is slightly more expensive in its own right, but we're saving at least probably 12 months of preliminaries. So it starts to make
what
the
is
whole
that
building
slide
more
saying?
cost.
Is that slide saying that only less than 30% of capital spend is going into actual bricks and mortar, and the rest is going into management?
Effectively, yes. So when you start to analyze the cost of a project in its totality, about 30% of it is the bricks and mortar, and the rest is the design team, the project management, the client management, and everything else that goes wrapped around a project, which nobody really looks at either in terms of efficiency or cost control. Everybody focuses in on the construction element, which is a smaller element of the total cost of acquiring a building. Should we be looking at efficiencies in the design process to drive cost out of the design process? I know Ralph would probably squeal saying that his fees are too low on the architectural front in the first place. But is there a different way of designing a building that makes it more efficient but more profitable for the design team? Just raising some of these questions to think about this from a different angle.
Yeah, well, I think designers would say their fee is low if you're asking them to do the work 6 or 7 times.
Yeah, exactly.
But and then The answer is let's go and find a cheaper product, a cheaper brick or cheaper mortar to solve the problem, which isn't the problem. The problem is stop making me do the work 6 or 7 times. Let's just do it once.
Exactly. And that would therefore mean that the overall architectural cost would be maybe a bit cheaper, but considerably more efficient and more profitable for the design team firms. So I'm not looking at this in terms of a way of driving everybody to the bone in terms of costs. I'm looking at how can we make more money out of this, but make it cheaper for the client overall. Those are the sorts of things we need to consider. Just moving on to slightly different statistics. So this is, we're all familiar with extension of time because of time delays and what have you. This is an analysis of one of my colleagues in BIM Heroes, Al-Shima, pulled together from an article she wrote. And I've just tabularized this because I think it's a stunning statistic in its own right. Go to the far right-hand column, average extension of time EOT claimed. And across all regions of the world, that is averaging out between 60 and 80% extension of time on the original time frame. That, to me, is just mind-bending. That's across all projects in those regions on the number of projects that were looked at. And yeah, we're talking about hundreds of projects that were analysed in this analysis. And then you look at the average EOT value claimed. And again, it's multi-millions for each project, 90, 100 million or what have you. You know, these aren't insignificant sums. And this is just the time-related extension of time claim. This isn't the cost of actual variations or what caused the delay in the first place. This is just the extension of time. And you can start to look at that and think, wow, that is significant. And those are averages. So some projects will be going 200% over time. I mean, I remember the classic example of the Scottish Parliament building in Edinburgh, which started off with a budget of 40 million. And I think the final cost was something like 400 million. And off the top of my head, I don't know what the time delay was on it, but it was many years, not months, years. I mean, it was a complex design, admittedly, but these are the things that go on day in, day out in our industry. Some other issues that come up in terms of inefficiency. The cost of rework. This is where the builders have not met the quality standards. So 30% of actual construction physical work is actually redoing the work that's been done. That is a staggering figure in its own right. Up to 10% of project cost is lost due to poor coordination. And we know, all the clashes and other issues. And again, we've already mentioned about productivity growth is literally 1% over 20 years. So you look at rework in its own right, and these are just some statistics I pulled off the internet whilst putting this presentation together. The global annual cost of rework is $625 billion. Just let that figure sink in. 625 billion in just cost of reworking through poor quality. I mean, it's 20 billion in the UK alone. I mean, look at how many hospitals you could build without 20 billion in the UK or Ireland or what have you. Each country is going to be similar sorts of statistics. I don't know what your thoughts are about that in terms of how this is down to managing the quality of what's been done on site effectively.
Yeah, it is shocking. I mean, 20 billion could build a few hospitals, I'm sure, a few houses or a few schools. And 20 billion in waste is it's shocking.
Yeah, and then you add that into the sustainability calculations for your ESG reporting, which a lot of big companies now have to do in Europe, at any rate, mandatorily have to report against it. That's got a big impact on the sustainability argument as well, let alone the wasted cost.
Yeah. I mean, you mentioned the Scottish Parliament building, and shocking as that is, I remember reading about that last year, and I thought, well, actually, that's not a one-off case. It's actually
No.
quite common that projects end up like that. And even in Ireland, we have a hospital project that's started out at 600 million, and it's probably going to end up over 2 billion. It hasn't finished yet, but it's, it will be the most expensive hospital in the world. It could have been, we could have built a hospital in each major city for that price, if we approached it correctly.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, I was going to discuss that scenario because that is a shocking project, how that spiraled out of control. And there are multiple
it's not shocking.
reasons.
That's the point I'm trying to make. It's not shocking because actually a lot of projects end up like that. It's not that's obviously a big number, but a lot of projects start off with small budgets and end up, with maybe 2 or 3 times the price and, 2 or 3 times the amount of time. So it's quite common that we build things, and it costs more than we expect, and it takes longer than we expect. And also the quality is always making compromises in quality as we go along. So it starts with all these grand plans of meeting certain quality criteria, but as they go along, everybody's put under pressure to accept a lower quality. And the end product is always lower quality than was expected at the beginning. So that's quite common. And I think that's what I was trying to say. It's not unusual.
I think everybody's almost become accustomed to it. So it's an accepted way of life now that this is what happens. And you go back to that children's hospital in Dublin. Yes, the original contract price was 600, 800 million, whatever it was, which is still a significant sum of money for a hospital in its own right. But was that political drivers and political budgeting driving it down to that level when in reality the true budget was probably around 1.2 billion? I'm just plucking out figures, I've no idea. And if they'd accepted the 1.2 billion in the first place and kept strict controls in place, which I see a couple of people have commented about controls, that would have been brought in for about 1.2 billion. Yes, still twice the original tendered price, but way below the outturn cost that's currently happened. Because the stories I've heard about that particular hospital, where the contractor quoted stupid money to do a variation, the actual cost has come in at 1% of that, but they still demanded the full payment. There's all of that sort of adversarial stuff going on, which I'll come on to a little bit later as to why I think some of these issues are coming to bear, having looked at the whole situation. But these projects, you can analyze them and see, well, the whole basis was not started right, in my opinion. And some of that may have been politically driven.
Oh, certainly. I think everything you mentioned applies. It's not one thing or the other.
Yeah, exactly. This is a multifaceted issue, isn't it?
Yeah.
So, okay.
There's some issue with my microphone.
Sorry?
Someone's saying there's an issue with my microphone?
Yeah.
Yeah, you are slightly fuzzy for some reason.
You're breaking up,
okay.
So I'd switch to your laptop.
Okay.
This is a slide we've just been talking about in terms of delayed hospital. I've just made it anonymous here, but this is the project we were just talking about. Increased by 150% over the original budget or the original tendered sum. But there's a real issue there in terms of client-contractor blame spiral. Everybody's at each other's throats. It's adversarial. It's not conducive to coming up with solutions to resolve the problem because everybody's fighting with everybody else as to who is to blame for this, rather than everybody putting their hand up and saying, we've got this wrong, how do we resolve this? So these are some of the sorts of issues that come up as we go forward. This is from another article that appeared on BIM Heroes in the Data Governance CPD series, which I've lifted out. And this statistic when I saw this just absolutely blew my mind. That 90% of data in the AEC industry is unstructured. 90%. That is just mind-bending. And then when you get to the next statistic, get my teeth in, statistic, 96% of AEC data is actually unused. And you think, we've got all this rich source of data, and yet we're not structuring it, and then we're not even using it. That is just mind-bending to me, that there's this huge amount of inefficiency in an era where data is critical for everything. So how do we address this? How do we manage this? And I know there's been a lot of discussions going on the platform about quantum computing and quantum mindset and structuring data and data governance, etc. But it's clear at the moment we've got huge amounts of inefficiencies, and I'll come back to one of the critical factors in a little bit about this, as to what it really impacts. And I don't know what your view is on this, Ralph, but data management and use is a big issue, I think.
Absolutely. Yeah. Well, I think the incentives are all wrong. You know, what you get paid for is not for delivering structured or useful data.
Yeah.
You get paid for participating in a project, participating in the mess, basically. You know, attending meetings, having endless discussions, answering emails that have already been answered, but you forgot to read the email, etc. You know, like you're getting paid for your time to participate in this unstructured process, rather than, if somebody said to you, you're not going to get paid unless you deliver verifiable, trustworthy data, that would change the incentive. But that's not the incentive pattern at the moment.
No.
You're not getting paid for that. So that's probably the start of the problem.
So data is another aspect of the inefficiencies and reduced productivity. There is a massive resource there that we should be harnessing far better than what we currently are. So when you look at this, there's still a massive misconception about what BIM is, building information modeling. How often do we just see BIM used as a 3D drawing tool only, and that's it? Or how often do we see it being set up in the technical design stage, the detailed design stage, just for looking at clash detection and managing information in a small way? This goes on to the next point to me is, and again, this is why we've got to change how we look at setting up projects. The critical thing that's missing out of all of this is data is not structured for life cycle use. It's primarily used at the moment for design and potentially some of the construction elements. But it is not structured other than often for just design, and even then it's not probably structured properly. But when it comes to the life cycle, I'm talking about the operational stage of a project. And when you look at the whole life cycle of a project, construction may be 20 or 30% of the total cost of a project over its life cycle of 50 years. The rest is the operational maintenance cycle. Now, I've got a good friend of mine that was involved in a major hospital project, and he was really excited that the project was designed on BIM. And he went to set up all of his operational procedures and the asset register and everything else, and he couldn't get a single stitch of information out of the BIM model because it hadn't been set up for that structure of data to be used. And he tried every which way and he just couldn't use it. And as a result of that, he couldn't set the project up from the data that already existed. He had to waste time and effort rebuilding everything manually from asset registers all the way through. And that just amplifies in real life that 90%, 96% data usage or non-usage that we've already sort of briefly discussed. And then you're missing out, particularly for those of you in the UK, sorry.
I was just going to say about your
thing.
friend there. I think that's a very important thing, because your friend came in at the end expecting to find something.
Yeah.
That wasn't there. But
yeah,
that almost highlights the problem. Your friend should have been there at the beginning.
Absolutely.
Saying this is what I expect to find at the end. So that it's difficult to say who's at fault. Is it your friend that's at fault for not setting up the expectations early enough, or just sort of assuming that those expectations would be met? So that's the challenge. Like, I think that's probably going to come onto your procedure, is start with the end in mind.
Absolutely. But yeah, I mean, you're spot on. But what was even more frightening about this example was that this was a private finance stroke PPP project where the consortium was set from day one. So the FM operations should have been heavily involved from day one. They had every opportunity to be involved from day one. And I've done a lot of PFI PPP projects from an FM perspective. And I was there when the contract was signed, and I was there all the way through the design. In fact, one big hospital project I did, which was the Barts and London project, which was a monster project, I actually had an architect in my FM team, and his sole role was to look at the design from an operational perspective. Because he could talk the language architect to architect, but he understood where I was coming from the operational point of view, and therefore he could dialogue properly with the design team. And we picked up so many design issues that if the architect hadn't been there, that project would have been a complete disaster when we went to go live. I'll give you an example. They had to remove a lift because it breached a height restriction on the building in terms of the lift motor room. So they decided, well, there's many lifts in this building, we'll drop that one down to the 5th floor, and it won't be accessible on the 5th floor, just to be accessible ground to 4th floor. Well, that just happened to be the FM lift area. And we looked at this from an operational point of view. So, well, if you do that, we're going to have to drag all the dirty linen out through the wards because there's no other route to take it out. And infection control will not allow that. So you're going to have to redesign that whole floor plate in that area to allow us to segregate clean and dirty, which is classic hospital design. But they hadn't thought that. They hadn't looked at that. If we'd allowed that to be built and then came along, well, how are we going to get the dirty linen out of this area? There would have been a major delay and a redesign and a rebuild. So it's critical that the operational piece is involved at the beginning. Why that happened in that particular instance on that hospital, I don't know. I suspect my friend was not brought in to the last moment and he wasn't aware of that project because it was part of a big company that he was involved in. But the PFI consortium should have had somebody there from the operational point of view from the very beginning. It's absolutely critical.
That's not the mindset. So this comes back to the mindset in the industry is we'll wait until the design and construction team are 2 or 3 months away from handover, and then we'll get involved.
Exactly.
And that's, even if you have these PPP type projects where you have the whole consortium together, that mindset still exists. And we've been involved in those types of projects where even in a joint venture, the asset management piece of that venture still is disengaged and disinterested until the capital delivery team have reached a certain point, because it's just the way they've done business for the last 20 years. And in fact, going back, if you wanted to be a little bit cynical about it, the way FM companies make money is by inheriting buildings without data, because that means they can charge the client lots of money to send surveyors around and recapture and re-input data. So there's a lot of the business model of facilities management is captured in that wasteful practice of doing the hard handover, So, like soft landings, I don't know if you know about it, but soft landings was such a brilliant thing, but it's never really taken off because soft landings doesn't suit the business model of charging clients loads of money to deal with a hard landing.
Yeah, exactly.
It's lucrative business.
Yeah,
it comes back to the wrong incentives.
Yeah, you're absolutely spot on, Ralph. The incentives are all wrong, the cultures are wrong. And, you and I have had many a discussion on why we aren't broadening this out to AECO. And you rightly say that the operational phase or the operational people are not ready to come on board yet because they themselves don't know what they want or how they want to deal with it. But until you bring the O part into the equation, we're going to have all this inefficiency, in my opinion. So that sort of summarizes what we've just been talking about. Often the project manager can't link into the data to do all his scheduling like he should be able to do automatically. The cost consultant can't link in to pick up all the variations automatically from the BIM model. And there are exceptions, I accept that where this does work. But one of the biggest controls is where you link the cost and the scheduling together so you price out the schedule so you can look at your cash flow. You can only do that if you've got integrated data across those two elements in the first place. But if you start measuring your cost data against your program, and the program guy is saying, well, we're at 80% complete on this element, but the cost guy is saying, well, we're only at 30% spend, so how can that be true? And there may be valid reasons, but it's another eyes and ears on what's going on, another triangulation, if you like, which we can only use if we integrate all our data together.
But can I say, in defense of design teams, as an architect, I've never, in 30 years, I've never had a project manager come to me and say, at the start, this is the information I need to do my analysis or I've never had a cost consultant come to me as an architect saying, this is how I need the data presented to me in order to do, more efficient cost takeoffs. And I've never had an FM or asset management come to me at the start of a project and say to me, this is the data that I would need to effectively take over and manage this building. So, I think it's very easy to blame the design team for what hasn't happened after the fact, but I think there's a responsibility on particularly these three professions that you've listed on the slide, to be upfront before the work has been done. Because one of the most irritating things for me as an architect is you work for 3 or 4 months really hard producing the information, and then someone says to you afterwards, oh, actually, that isn't what I needed. Could you go away and redo the work? I mean, of course, nobody's going to pay me for that extra work. And you can see the reluctance. So just to defend, I suppose, the design professions a bit, and to remind these professions that you have on the screen in particular, that if you don't say beforehand what it is you actually want, then you're not going to get it. And I often say to people, you get what you ask for and you deserve what you get.
And I couldn't agree more. I'm on exactly the same view. And I apologize if I'm sort of inferred that it was a design team responsibility. It's not. If anything, it's the client's responsibility to make sure this happens, but the client doesn't often understand this. And
well, I don't know if it's the client's responsibility, because the reason the client hires professionals is because they don't have the understanding. I mean, if they had the full understanding, they wouldn't need the professional. Like when I go to a doctor, I don't expect the doctor doesn't expect me to bring him all the medical diagnosis and the medical treatment, etc. That's why I'm going to the doctor. He's the professional.
Exactly.
So I don't like that argument that it's the client's fault either, because the client is paying professionals to help them. That's the whole
true.
point.
Yeah, yeah. Yeah, that's a very good point as well. But I think what we are agreed on is these people need to be involved. These professions need to be involved more. So again, it's a cultural change that has to be brought to the industry to start to improve all the inefficiencies that we've highlighted already.
It's moving from reactive, because all these professions, project management, cost management, FM, they're all reactive. They wait for everyone to make a mess, and then they react afterwards.
Yeah.
And
yeah.
Instead, they need to be proactive and say, if we don't want a mess, this is what we need. And and that will also avoid the scenario where design teams are expected to produce the information 6 or 7 times, because people haven't said up front what it is they want. So it's actually good for everyone.
Yeah.
To do it the right way around.
Yeah, and I think this is where education is needed in the industry for everybody to get involved, as well as new systems and ways of doing things. Those 3 professions that are on the screen at the moment need to be educated. They have to be involved and they have to be proactive to get the information they want. And if they did, then the whole project will start to become more efficient. So there is a number of cultural issues and mindset issues that need to be brought into play. And on last week's planning session with Plannerly, we talked about mindset, and that is a big issue, I think, in the industry. There's too much dogma and set in stone ideals that have got to change. So anyway, that's where we're at the moment, which brings me on to some of the traditional project management fails in terms of the reactive, exactly what we just said, the siloed decision making, and that is a critical thing here. There's also a lack of clear outcomes and alignment. Not everybody's on the same page, and there are methods to be able to do that if it's set up correctly in the first place. And then the current structure of contracts and what have you almost pushes disjointed workflows. Another party that should be brought in a lot earlier is construction expertise, and particularly the specialist contractors who have so much knowledge to add into the design phase, but they're never there. I don't know what experience you've had in that arena, Ralph.
I think they've been since the Egan report in 1998. The industry's been saying that, but it hasn't materialized.
No.
It's so obvious that the people who know how to build, the specialist subcontractors and the trades, should have input into the constructability of a design before it gets, before the work gets executed on site. But everyone's been saying that, but it hasn't materialized. And I think it comes back to this incentive structure and the way things are procured, because we all know that. There's not a single person who doesn't know that having the expertise around the table earlier would be more beneficial. And yet we continue to push this idea of bringing in the expertise as late as possible.
Yeah. See, there's some really good points. I don't know, Ken, whether we can capture all the comments from the chat so we can have some dialogue on that later. But just quickly monitoring what's been said, Shane's come up with a very good point in terms of getting the FM people involved. And I've seen a couple of other comments that are very relevant to what we're discussing. So within our community, there is the beginnings of understanding as to where we need to go with this. But it's getting that wider industry engaged in these issues. So we end up with the ripple effect. So delays, that moves on to missed revenue, which means that in a commercial project, the return on investment is not coming in early enough. On, say, a hospital or a school project, there's big social impact, which is never talked about or measured properly. So you go back to the Dublin Children's Hospital project. Those children have been waiting an extra 2 years to get the facilities they really need to be able to sort them out with their various medical conditions. Yes, they've got an existing hospital, but it's not working to modern standards because it's old and not been invested in because the new hospital's coming. And I think Ralph made an earlier point that if they kept it to the 1.2 billion, which it probably should have been valued at, there's another 800 million that could have been spent on other hospital facilities, not just this one. So the ripple effect is huge in terms of the impact on society, on cost, and what have you. We've already discussed rework leads to wasted resources, which in this day of ESG reporting really has a big impact on sustainability. I think the construction industry has got to be one of the most litigious industries in the world, which keeps a huge element of the legal profession well-oiled with all of their legal costs, etc., which you could say is a benefit to society overall because we're generating economic activity through the legal system, but it's inefficient and it's wasting resources on the built environment. And this all undermines trust and overall project success in the way I'm trying to define it. So there's massive ripple effects on this. We have fragmented delivery models. You know, the design, bid, build splits responsibility. Contractors, which we've already discussed, are brought in far too late. And designers are not incentivized for buildability or operability. Whether that's the right phrase to use, I don't know what Ralph thinks about that, but should designers be incentivized for making a building buildable or operable?
Well, I mean, there was a time in history where designers were the master craftsmen, but that there was a split between design and construction, and that split is well entrenched now. So I think there's a clear understanding that designers don't build stuff. You know, they design stuff, and other people have to build it. So that means the people who actually build stuff have to have some input. You know, and they do have input, but the problem is they only have input now at the moment when the project gets to site, and that's the first time that people who know how to build stuff actually have a look at it and say, well, actually this is quite difficult to build, or it's not the best way to build it. And it's too late, because everybody knows the most expensive and most disruptive and most dangerous time to make any change is when you're on site. Yeah, and
absolutely.
But that's the way our contracts are set up. You know, like the first opportunity that specialist contractors have to have any input is once the contract is signed and once the job is on site, and that's too late. It's
far too late.
What BIM allows, I suppose, coming back to BIM, is it allows us to construct the building virtually in software and bring those specialists into the virtual environment and saying, have a look at this, can we construct it before it gets to site? So, you know, and if we need to make changes, that's the time to make a change, because it's really quick and easy and cheap and safe to make a change in software. It's and you know, that's the the kind of restructuring we need to bring into the process.
I mean, from my point of view, I've looked at this in detail over the last 2 years, taking my considerable experience of projects from all sides of the world, from construction, from FM operations, from whole life cycle approach. And in my opinion, most clients don't actually understand what they really require, because they're not asked that. Often clients don't even understand their own internal processes. So if they don't understand their own internal processes, how can they brief a design team as to what they need the building to do? So often
maybe they're not expected to. I think that's maybe a client. That's why they hire professionals.
Possibly. But there's a whole angle here that professionals should be asking these questions to drag that out of the client to end up with a more detailed brief, which I know was one of the earlier comments that was made. We've already discussed that a lot of design teams don't understand operational requirements or even construction technologies necessarily. And that's not necessarily dig at the design professions, because it may not be their role to understand those issues, but it could be an idea that somebody needs to extract that and then brief the design team properly, who understands the operational viewpoint. Hence my statement of you need to start with the end game in mind. So you need to bring your operational FMs or manufacturing managers in to develop the project brief for the design team to then work from. And then you've got the contractor coming in on low margins, looking for variations, etc. Whereas if the project is designed properly in the first place, there will be minimal variations, and he then should be able to bid at decent margins to get the job done right the first time. You know, there's some radical stuff here, but we need to look at this, I think.
Well, if I could add to this, if you could go back to that last slide.
Sure.
Just if you work from the bottom up, when you say a project is designed properly, you're assuming that it's designed with constructability and operational ability in mind. And so you would say, well, the contractors would have had to have input into the design, because the contractors bring the constructability experience. And so if they haven't had input into the design, then it's never going to be designed properly. And the same with the design team. You could say if the design team have not had engagement with the client to offer their professional advice to the client as to what it is the client actually wants. So at the moment we assume everything works from the top down, but actually it should be working from the bottom up. And I would put a fourth element on this slide, which is the operators. Because if the operators aren't giving their input into the whole process, then what they receive at the end will also not be fit for purpose. And so we've got to take away the lines between these and create a conversation, a collaboration between all these things, working from the bottom up, not from the top down.
Right. I was going to ask a quick poll, but time's pressing now. We've had a good discussion, so I'll skip that. But I think we all probably know that we're suffering from delays, cost overruns, quality failures, disputes. I think that's a given. So I'll just go into the summary, and then I'll start to go forward as to where we want to take things. So my summary of what we've discussed is the traditional process is broken. We've got to find new ways of making it better. Fragmentation causes failure, the silo mentality that we still have. And I remember a slide from last week's planning seminar that showed the silos all still there, even though they're wrapped up in one team. The Chinese walls still exist between the various professions. And I'm not just talking about the design profession, I'm talking about all professions that ought to be involved. As we've seen, data is not used, and that is a massive missed opportunity, in my opinion. And therefore, productivity, efficiency, and competitiveness are falling flat because we're not improving. If anything, everything's getting more complicated, but we're not innovating to make it more efficient. So I don't know whether you've got a last word on that before I move towards the how do we get out of this mess? You okay with that summary, Ralph?
That's the wicked problem, isn't it? It's I think it's almost like we can all see the problems happening, but the behaviors are so entrenched that it's difficult to overcome them, because everything leads on from something else, and without undoing the whole lot, how do you correct it? Is
exactly
the big question.
So in terms of what we're about, we're looking at how to streamline construction, how to build faster, better, and for less, use the data for the long-term benefit of the client, and structure the whole process with aligned outcomes, reduced risk, and empowering all the teams to be more efficient. That's effectively where I'm trying to come from with where we move forward. So it's looking at things in a whole new way. So we've looked at the whole process, and from point 5 onwards is a traditional way of concept design, spatial design, etc. But we think there are 3 elements up front that need to be looked at in far more detail before anybody else gets involved. So this is evaluating the whole project in more detail, looking at the project viability, because often projects are built and then they're not viable economically because they haven't been looked at correctly in the first place. And then the critical phase is the project setup. And I think this is where we start to formulate all the documentation for the design team to be able to design properly, bringing all the project managers, the cost controllers, and the client's operational team involved at this early stage, and then setting up everything correctly, setting up all the data structures correctly for the BIM model so that everybody can get data out at the end. This is a major departure, and I know clients are going to go, well, that's going to take time before I can get to site. I've got the site, it's costing me money already. But my view is if you don't do these 3 elements, the whole project is going to be delayed and cost more at any rate. So by doing this up front, planning properly, you're trying to plan and save money up front by getting it right first time. So that the architect doesn't have to do what Ralph has already said, the rework 4 or 5 or 6 times, which is common. If they have all this detail in the first place, the design team has a far better chance of designing it right first time. Yeah, they may not get everything right first time, but they'll get a damn sight more than what they are at the moment because they've got better information to work from. And then picking up on what Ralph said in terms of the UK government's soft landings approach, what I'm saying is after every single stage, there should be a full stakeholder review and sign off. So that focuses people's minds to sign off at each stage and say, yes, this is right. And if they shout up later, then they've got egg on face because they signed up to it in the first place. So that really focuses people's mind to get it right first time by signing off at every single stage. I don't know what thoughts you've got on that, Ralph, in terms of
what if you put number 10 in number 1's place?
Well, that is part of the project evaluation process.
Yeah.
So
that you actually, if you were going to build a hospital, you start before you speak to designers and contractors. You say, we're going to build a hospital. What's operationally? What is it that we want, and how do we want it to work? And you get the professionals that will be running this hospital for the next 50 years into a room and say, what is it you want? Because I don't believe any hospital has ever been designed like that.
No.
It's like hire an architect first and come up with a concept, etc., and go down, and then 3 months before handover, the operational team are called in, and that's when it all starts to unravel.
You're absolutely right. When I worked on the Barts London hospital project, the hospital team did have what they called the clinical adjacencies team, which were looking at, for instance, on the operating theatre, you wouldn't put the operating theatre in the middle of the building and the anaesthetic room at the other end and the recovery room at the other end. You have that all clustered around the operating theatres. So there was elements of that happening, but I don't think it was done efficiently. And yes, we were involved operationally, and we picked up a lot of stuff, which is a whole other webinar in its own right as to what we got changed because we were there from day one. The lift example I've already talked about. We had the plant room example as well. There's a number of things from not a clinical operational, but just a building facilities operational phase that we influenced from change to make it better because we were there from day one. And we were looking, or I was looking at what happens 20 years down the line to this building when you've got to replace the boiler. How do you get it out? And the design team hadn't even thought about that because nobody looks long-term into the building. They put the boiler on the 18th story in a crowded inner city site.
Well, I think
it wasn't going to work.
in my view, what the soft landings approach laid out in BS 8536 is basically saying is put number 10 at number 1. Like get a soft landings champion on the team right at the beginning who can bring operational and outcome expectations right at the beginning, and that person or party or whatever is follows the whole process through to make sure that what's delivered at the end actually meets what was expected. And it's a brilliant, I mean, it's so sad really that BS 8536 hasn't made it into the international arena as an ISO standard, because it's one of the most, it's such a short standard, but it's so interesting in its approach to delivering outcomes, because it's not about delivering just buildings, but it's delivering the outcome that you want the building or piece of infrastructure to meet. So it's
absolutely. So which standard was that again?
BS 8536, which is it's a standard for briefing design teams with facilities management in mind, basically. Yeah.
Okay.
So it's basically soft landings captured in a British standard.
Yeah. So I'm just going to quickly wrap up now. We've had a fantastic discussion, but by doing that, overall, you're going to reduce costs. You're going to have better quality. It's going to be less cost to build and less cost to operate overall. And that's another critical thing is the cost to operate, which is very rarely considered. So key takeaways here, we've got to start putting in structured systems to create more predictable outcomes. We've got to increase efficiency and productivity, otherwise we're just going to sink in the mire. And the big standout for me is we've got to start using data in a far better way than we're currently doing. I mean, have you got any thoughts on what we need to improve?
Everything. It's not one thing or the other thing. It's everything. That's our new motto in BIM Heroes. It's quantum.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah, everything influences everything else. So you got to be holistic. You can't. There's no easy sticky plaster that you can just stick on a broken system.
We could go on forever, but I'm conscious of time. And I'm thanking everybody for hanging on to the end, which is great. We are planning on a series of webinars, hopefully monthly or thereabouts, to start looking at some of the stuff we've talked about in terms of how we improve the industry. So we're looking at the project evaluation, how that should be done correctly, looking at project viability and the project setup, those 3 phases that I said are mission critical, and then going through some of the other elements that we currently do to explore how we could improve, so that this overall webinar series will end up as a blueprint as to the way forward, in my opinion, as to where things go. And I'm welcome for any other opinion or input into this, because I think we've got, as part of BIM Heroes, we've got the ability to change the industry from this platform. And I passionately believe we should be doing that. So I don't know whether you've got any last thoughts or words, Ralph?
I think it's been a fantastic introduction. It's so desperately needed, and I really look forward to the series, because I think we can all get something from it.
Yeah, exactly.
So thank you, Ian, for initiating it.
That's my pleasure. That's my passion as well. I really want to see this happen. Well, thank you very much for attending, and I hope you've got something out of it. It's been a good discussion, Ralph. Thank you for your input. Really appreciate it.
No problem.
Brought it to life with a different perspective. And we look forward to the next episode, if you like.